Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak here today. So I wanted to talk about the financial sector, the SDGs, interconnection, and future directions, also related, of course, to regulations and voluntary codes of conduct, so things that are already have been addressed here. So I want to start with the kind of an exercise, it's kind of an academic one that we do often in innovation and social innovation, and thinking about what happens if we do the opposite. So what happens if we have the unsustainable development goals? And this could be a starting point, and I don't want to doom and gloom here, but everybody could think about what do we do currently, so what activities do we provide, and that's not only in our job, so each morning you have breakfast, whatever you do, that contradicts to the sustainable development goals. And then maybe think about what can we do better to do the opposite. And this can be private, this can be investment, like whatever it is. So just to give a kind of input and a kind of line of thought, but what we see, so there's a UN report saying financial system must change or SDGs will fail. So from a UN SDG point of view, probably that's a quite good argument. The question, on the other hand, is, and that I think the other panelists mentioned that as well, why should the financial system care themselves? So why should the financial system be the system that has the main contribution to the SDGs? And I would argue, just to kind of talk about the conclusion already, because it's in the best interest of the financial system as well. And so what do we find in this report? So it says multilateral institutions need to adapt and to reform, strengthen the collective action to support sustainable development. Remaking of global financial architecture, sovereign debt, international tax norms, international trade systems. We have to address that. Create national financing frameworks to support national development plans. We have shift to a more long-term way of thinking by all, including the private sector, that was mentioned already as well. Regulatory frameworks to address risks from and opportunities of technology as well. So what role does technology play to achieve the sustainable development goal? Finally, they say not to invest will impact everyone, including the financial industry. So I just want to emphasize, it's not a matter of choice, so let's invest in sustainable issues. The question is, what happens if we don't? When I talk to the insurance companies that have a long-term investment, pension funds as well, and if you are invested in things like forestry, you have to think in a 30-year investment cycle, and maybe there's an impact in 30 years because of different environmental impacts. So we have a huge financing gap, and I think we discussed this already. I don't want to go through all these figures again. It was mentioned in the morning. What I find always interesting, official development aid 2016, just everything is in trillion, but ODA is in billion. So there is something that has to be done. Probably. So, and another main issue that was mentioned yesterday morning, I think funds to least developed countries are decreasing. So it's not we invest more in these countries that really need that money, but it's decreasing, and we have to figure out why. Why does that happen? And one issue could be, and it was discussed, that countries have to develop, of course, bankable projects and good governance. It was mentioned before, for an investor, we need to create a return. We need to create some kind of security. So we have to provide an environment that is attractive for investment as well. So which are the SDGs that are favored by industry, prioritized goals by all industry? SDGs 13, 8, and 12. Financial industry 13, 8, and 4. Citizen priorities, of course, no poverty, zero hunger, and SDGs 3, good health. So the question, why are these differences? Why do we have these differences here? So we have to be aware that there's a strong interaction between the SDGs. And the question is, how can you directly address poverty? Probably you can't. You can invest in something that decreases poverty. But it's hard, the only thing, otherwise you can donate money to someone. But if you want to eradicate poverty, you have to think about what you do. And so, of course, decent work and economic growth is a way to decrease poverty and to eliminate hunger as well. So the question is, how can we address these goals? And so there are already some regulations and voluntary codes of conduct around that I just want to talk about. So there are some regulations, and there's a new IMF sustainable finance group as well that has members of different countries, but we have regulations in China. EU has a new regulation, sustainable finance, Bangladesh, Brazil, Nigeria. Interesting, these cases, and I go a bit more into detail into some of them. Nigeria, for example, why do they do that? So they have a sustainability regulation for banks that they should access to finance, that they should provide access to finance. Why do they do that? Because they are dependent on financing from other multilateral development finance organizations. And nobody wants to invest in the bank in Nigeria if they don't address sustainability issues. So it's in their own interest to do that. So the main interest was kind of pressure from others. So in addition, we have some codes of conduct as well. UNEP Financial Initiative, probably everybody knows them. Equator Principles, UNPRI, some smaller global alliance for banking and values and impact investing and reporting standards. So let's start with China. They have a green credit policy that is the result of the environmental policy in China, mainly to reduce air pollution. So it's not coming from the financial sector again. It's coming from Ministry of Environment. They want to decrease air pollution. So everybody has to contribute to that, and one way is to increase the amount of green landing and to decrease the amount of so-called polluting or brown landing. The interesting thing is here that there's a strong correlation in China that green businesses have better financial returns than other businesses. So it makes sense from a financial point as well. So they have introduced key performance indicators as a part of the annual reporting to the regulator. And again, it's as I mentioned before, it's not that they want to regulate the contribution to the SDG, but the regulation is on financial sector risks. So how are we exposed to risks because we address or not address sustainability issues? And some outcome, we did a study, there are other studies as well that show that there's a correlation between lending to green industries and credit risk default. So there's a positive connection with that. Another interesting country, Bangladesh, we know it's heavily affected by environmental issues. It's a main producer for textiles for others. Very intensive or very strong environmental impacts there. And again, the goal of the guideline there, Green Credit Guideline, protection of banks from financial risk and reduction of environmental impacts. So they are an interesting tool they have tools to analyze these environmental risks and have reduced interest rates for certain projects so that banks can lend to these projects. So they do that. There's one outcome, we see a strong correlation between being greener and credit risks. So if you introduce sustainability indicators into your credit risk assessment, you are better able to predict the risks in this case. Relatively new regulation, the EU High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. Their goal is to steer the flow of capital towards sustainable investments, identify steps that financial institutions and supervisors should take to protect the financial system from sustainability risk. Again, it's about the financial system, not about the SDGs. So they want to establish a EU sustainability taxonomy, starting with climate mitigation to define areas where investment are needed most. It's governed by the European Commission. It's very new. It was just published, I think, end of last year, so we don't have any concrete outcomes of that regulation. What else do we have? Bank of England assesses climate-related financial risks. They started with the insurance sector, now in the banking sector as well. Bank of Canada recently started to investigate how climate change will affect the country's economy. Just realized that especially in north of Canada, temperatures rising twice as much as in other parts of the world. Dutch Central Bank, another SDG, water risks. Of course, in the Netherlands, water risks are a big issue. Rising sea levels could have an effect, but also droughts. For example, last year was a major drought in Europe. So they analyze water risk in the Dutch financial industry. And of course, we have the Financial Stability Board, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosure. What is missing a bit, I think, is to address other SDGs as well. It's a lot about environmental issues. The question is, what are the risks for the financial sector and also the opportunities for the financial sector of the other SDGs? We have a number of codes of conduct, United Nations Environment Program, Finance Initiative that promotes sustainable finance. An interesting thing that they have recently come up with a kind of, I think it's manifest on impact investing, so to have a positive impact on sustainable development. That's not a regulation, it's a guideline how you can do that. We have the Equator Principles that are established for quite a long time that focus on project finance. So big projects, energy, for example, or big industry projects. How can we manage social and environmental risk in this field? We have UNPRI that are the institutional investors, mainly are members there, and they try to find out how can we do more sustainable investment. Smaller organizations like Global Alliance for Banking on Values, they specifically focus on how can the financial sector contribute to sustainable development. So it's less a risk mitigation issue, but it's rather an impact finance issue. And finally, there's the impact reporting investment standards that try to come up with standards to measure whether we have really a positive impact. Or just having a goodwill to do something doesn't mean we have a positive effect at the end. So we need indicators, we need to measure these things. Finally, there is in the US Sustainable Accounting Standards Board that tries to identify and manage and report the sustainability topics that matter most to investors. Again, it's materiality, and it should support fiduciary duty. Because there are approaches now that say if you don't take these risks into account, you contradict your fiduciary duty. So you cannot just say, if I have the financial returns, that's fiduciary duty. You have to talk about other risks as well. That's one aspect. The other aspect is it depends what your clients want. If your clients want to invest in things that have a positive impact on sustainability and might have lower returns, that's their will. So you have to follow them as well. And that's an opportunity. And I think there are some interesting statistics that say that especially younger investors focus more on ethical investment, social responsible investment, things like that. So they develop a set of sustainability key performance indicators that are material for investors, and they want to support transparency and standardization, and that directly addresses fiduciary duty. If you're not transparent, you contradict your fiduciary duty. So what are the conclusions? So 2 ways to support. First is just reducing to finance what prevents to achieve the goals. So if we know that we finance issues that are in contrast to the SDGs, why do we continue? Maybe we have to, but at least we should think about how we can stop doing that. And then, of course, increase financing for what helps to achieve the goals and take it as an opportunity. It's not only a risk issue. So my final conclusions for regulators, if they integrate sustainability indicators into financial regulation to address sustainable development and financial stability, I think that's important. There are other bodies that should mainly focus on sustainable development. I think that's clear, but it can help to address that if it connects to financial stability. Analyzing the connection between sustainable, non-sustainable finance and financial risks. Regulators do a lot of analysis about financial stability, so just do it. It's a study. If we have more evidence, if we have more empirical data, yes, let's do that. We can implement guidelines to how to address the SDGs, and mainly not only to focus on risks, what is the main focus currently, and collaborate between financial regulators, other governing bodies that address environmental and social issues. And I think that's also a big problem that if you look in, more or less in all countries, Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment usually don't talk to each other. Other ministries don't do that as well, but maybe there's a way to overcome this barrier. What about for the voluntary codes of conduct? So far, they are mainly addressing risks. So they want to avoid environmental and social risks. So they should maybe add positive impacts. So these are voluntary codes of conduct. So why not provide additional information, guidelines on how to address the SDGs in a positive way? Introduce benchmarking, including sanctions. There's a lot of criticism, for example, about UNPRI that if you pay, you're a member, whatever you do. Do you really invest sustainably? And there's a big discussion about whether there should be benchmarks and sanctions as well. Develop guidelines about policies, about do's and don'ts with regard to the SDGs, so be more clear in what the financial sector could do. So, from my point of view, addressing the SDGs is not a nice to do, it's necessary to avoid future negative consequences for society and the financial industry. And again, for me, that's a part of financial fiduciary duty as well. And there are some papers from some law scholars that integrate these things into fiduciary duty. We have many opportunities today, so we have a kind of time window to be active. It doesn't mean that in 15 or in 2030 everything is bad, but we have a certain time limit to be active. So we have today, but we have many opportunities. I think if we don't take them, we have to deal with risks. That's relatively clear. And how we can frame it is from the business case of sustainability. So always thinking about how can these things integrated into business. Maybe we should change about thinking about how can businesses contribute to sustainable development. Why not? So each business also has a societal duty, and so we could change our approach from the business case of sustainability to the sustainability case of business. And with that, I want to finish. Thanks a lot.